So basically, what am I looking at? Also like Monica, sorry Monica, not, did I say Monica? Yes, Monica. Basically what I'm doing is basically, this is a component of a 4-paper PhD, and basically this is the first part. So basically what I'm looking at in my PhD is how do international organizations and international NGOs evaluate their communication programs. So the first stepping stone for me in this, apart from a literature review in this area, was really to look at, well, actually, what have they done so far? So what are international organizations and NGOs doing to evaluate their communication programs? By communication programs, we mean public information, public outreach, advocacy, public relations, corporate communication programs. I group them all under the term communications, as is done in the literature, in the study of communications. So I chose a time period, 15 years, and basically what I set out to do was to determine what have they done so far. And a bit like Monica, my basis, my body of study for this part of my PhD was evaluation reports. So it's isolated in that regards, and I'll go on and explain a bit later about that. Other parts of my PhD look at, go beyond that, and look at, well, you know, how is evaluation used in communication programs in specific case studies. But this is sort of trying to get an overview, with, of course, the limitations which I'll explain also. So the systematic review, as Monica explained very well, and when I read her paper before coming here, it enlightened me and thought, ooh, maybe I'm doing more of a meta-evaluation, but anyway, so we'll get on to that. Basically, what we're doing here is synthesizing findings from multiple studies reports in a balanced and impartial way. That's sort of like academic definition of what is systematic review. Perhaps different from meta-evaluation, it uses a peer review protocol in that, like, you look at the studies or the reports, and then someone else looks at them and also makes a judgment. And then you compare and use statistical measures for reliability. I'll get onto that. It often focuses on effectiveness, questions of what works. So, you know, what were the results of the evaluations or the studies? I'm actually more interested, and this is where it's more closer to a meta-evaluation, I'm more actually interested in how is evaluation done? What are the methods that are done? And how rigorous is that? And as I said, a review is ideally conducted by two persons. Two persons, it's basically a question, it's like coding for content analysis, where you need a second person to cross-code. Basically, the process, now this is a process I followed, which is established in the literature of a systematic review. Development of the question, so what is the core question? The creation of the review protocol. You're going to measure reports, studies against something. So you need a sort of a criteria. The search, and as Monica said, getting the stuff is hard. And that's, of course, there's limitations in that, in what you can find, and I'll get onto that depending on what is the body of your studies. Application of the inclusion criteria, what goes in, what goes out. You find reports, what goes in, what goes out. Assessment against review protocol, so then you're actually doing the sort of coding, looking at the evaluations, and the findings. Now, in my study, basically, I put some of the main points here. The question was basically, you know, how these organizations evaluate their activities, and to what extent do they adhere to principles of evaluation methodology. So I'm interested in, you know, how are they undertaking the communications evaluation. I'm not interested in the results. What have the results shown in this study? The protocol, like the actual protocol that I used to look at each evaluation I found, was based on 6 evaluation principles, which I'll show in a minute. The evaluation design was a pre-post, post-only, pre-post using some data collected during the activity, etc. And coverage, was it global, regional, etc. I was only interested in evaluation of communication programs that were either global in their nature, like, you know, this is a global campaign we're doing. For example, Oxfam does a global campaign on climate change. Or is it regional? This is something that UNICEF has done across Asia, for example. My search was basically to look at all eligible organizations, and basically that comes down to the inclusion criteria. I have 230 eligible organizations, which are considered, if you like, the top tier international organizations and international NGOs. These are the ones you would normally think of, like UNICEF, WHO, the UN agencies, the EU is included, the institutions, also the major NGOs. As someone asked me, but did you pick these organizations yourself? No, it's based on legal definitions, basically, of what constitutes, for example, those NGOs with status with the UN. So I based it on a legal sort of basis, looking at the top tier organizations at the international level. My inclusion criteria, and this is just a summary, is really looking at, once again, the evaluations had to come from a certain type of organization. 230 was the total. The evaluation reports had to have a focus on communications, so that they had to be focused on the communication activities, not a global review of an organization with a little bit on communication activities that I wasn't interested in. And I mentioned this, and also the time period. Like Monica said, the hard thing was finding the reports. I wrote to all the organizations, I contacted all 230, I went on their websites to try and see what I could find. What did I find? Before I get to that, what I found was if I'm not wrong, 40, I've got the figure here in a second, 46 reports, basically of different communication activities. So it was enough to make an interesting study, and perhaps an indication of the level of what evaluation is undertaken of communication activities currently. Now, what I show you here, basically, because I've already done the systematic review, so I've already undertaken it, and I have it now in a format where I'm submitting it for publication. So what I'm telling you here is a bit of how I did it, and now I'll show you a bit what I've found. This is sort of like, a little bit like what Monica showed you. This is sort of like the protocol, review protocol. Here what you see, it's just a coding I used. The organization, the type, was it an NGO, was it an international organization, the year, the title of the study. For example, you can see the first one from CARE, International on Communications in Afghanistan. Coverage, the evaluation design, and these are the 6 principles. I'll show you in a minute what they were. And basically, what I was doing here was basically saying, looking at the report and saying, did they apply to principle 1, yes or no? And that's where the protocol comes in that for reliability questions, you have another person do exactly the same thing for each of the studies, and then you can have some reliability measures, which is important in this sort of study. So that's just a snapshot, and so I have that for each of the reports that I undertook. Now, basically a description of the body. So the body of this systematic review is, yes, I got it right, 46 reports. So 46 reports represented evaluation of 46 distinct communication activities of 22 organizations and 4 coalitions. So most organizations were represented once or twice, with the exception of the European Union, which has a large body of evaluation work in the communications area. So also you have this phenomena of coalitions, like for example where UNICEF will get together with, say, the children, and they'll launch communication activities. So that's what I would consider an alliance or a coalition. Majority of activities at the global level, etc., etc. The dominant sectors, like where were these organizations working in based on the, I believe, the OECD categories for sectorial sectors, mainly social, humanitarian aid, and agriculture, for example. So that's a sort of description of the body. Now, of the evaluation report. So the evaluation report is the body of the study. I also searched the literature, like academic literature, journals, but there's been nothing published in this area. The general findings, and here you can see, for example, some basic information. And here we have, for example, compliance with the 6 methodology principles. So here are the 6 methodology principles, for example, that I created. Now, these principles, I didn't create them myself. They're based on a literature, on evaluation literature applicable to communication activities. Of course, there's no agreement on what are the 6 main principles. I pulled these from the literature where, across some of the main research in this area, there's general agreement on how evaluation of communication activities should be done. And some of them you'll see apply for general evaluation in general. So here you can see, for example, basically the compliance. So that means, like, for example, you know, in 91% of the studies, there was a combination of evaluation methods used. The lowest compliance, for example, rigorous design, it was at 54%. If you're interested afterwards, I'll explain to you what is the definition of what is rigorous. It doesn't mean randomized controlled trial is the ultimately rigorous design. It's a question of looking at what's being evaluated and the level of rigor demanded. Of course, the one finding, if you think about it, is basically, this looks good in that basically when evaluation is done, it is usually done with certain respect to some of these principles. For example, quite high. It's usually not very rigorous, and also they have difficulty often showing the link to their overall organizational goals. At the same time, the overall prevalence, like how many organizations are actually doing evaluation of the communication activities, is quite low. Estimated at between 13 and 30%. In the industry, commercial sector, it's more often cited at around 50% on other studies that have been made. So based on what I could find, in terms of what has been done, the level of evaluation is quite low in these organizations for communication activities. That of course comes with the caveat, the limitation that of course maybe I didn't find everything. Because some organizations are undertaking evaluation, for example, the International Red Cross, a large organization, but they don't publish anything. And they're undertaking it in communications evaluation because I know, because I've worked for them before, and that's not published. So I of course explain that in my paper, that there are certain limitations about that. But I think what I have is a good overview of what's being done. Intercoder reliability, I won't go into the details, but basically this is the notion of applying the protocol and between the two coders that are looking at the studies to try and look at that. For example, on some points, for example, percentage agreement, where it means we both agree the same thing. For example, on a combination of evaluation methods, it's very easy to code that in a way, because you read the evaluation report and you say, do they use one or multiple methods? In that one, we had 100% agreement. It's much more harder in this area, the link to the organizational goals. We set out a criteria where we say, how does the evaluation report show the link to the organizational goals for the communication activities? And that we had a lower agreement because, of course, it's much more interpretive, open to interpretation. So that's basically some findings. And also what I did was I put it onto a sort of a Goodman scale, which is basically what you see here is compliance with the methodology principles, 1 to 6. The top shows, you know, who was top of the class. Report A2, for example, complied to all 6 principles. Here at the bottom of the class, A21 only was compliant with 4 principles. So in the conclusions then what I made was basically, I made some analysis to say, well, what does this tell us? You know, what does it mean for the evaluations that are at the top and for the evaluations that are at the bottom? And this is my last slide. Basically, what does it mean? Those most compliant, like those most compliant with evaluation principles, often they were evaluating a precise set of communication activities and or effects desired. So they were very precise. The communication program was relatively precise in what it was trying to set out. Like, we are trying to influence attitudes on this issue with this target public. So it's quite precise and therefore perhaps easier to evaluate. All were conducted externally by external consultants, and most use research designs other than post-only. So as you know, most evaluation reports, I think the current statistic is maybe 90% are done as post-only activities. In those that proved to be more rigorous, they had a combination. They didn't only use post-only data, but often, you know, some pre-data, some data collected during the activity. The least compliant. In the least compliant, they really had a difficulty to show basically links to the organizational goals. They used less rigorous research designs, and most used only one evaluation method. So once again, I go in my paper and I describe a bit about, well, you know, what does this mean for evaluation of communication activities, and I try and pull out different points in terms of conclusions. So I will conclude there. I thank you for your attention. You have my contact details here. You can already see the slides on my blog. Where else? Okay, thank you very much.